Solo and the Cheeseburger. One thing that Solo really loved was going for a ride in Dad's new sports car. Well, it wasn't a new sports car. In fact, it was very old, but it was still fairly new to Dad. Dad loved this car, as it allowed him to go for a ride with the roof down, the wind in his hair, and the sound of the engine in his ears. And unlike the motorcycle that Dad had been forced to give up some time ago, the car didn't require a sidecar to carry a passenger. Solo loved the bright red sports car for all the same reasons as Dad, but one reason in particular stood out. When Solo went for a ride in the family's SUV, he was relegated to the rear cargo area, and while he loved to people-watch, the one thing he couldn't do was stick his head out of the window. But in the sports car, this was part of the package. With the car's convertible roof down, there was nothing to stop the wind blowing Solo's hair back. It was meant to do this. The other advantage of riding in Dad's sports car with the roof down was the smells. Solo could not only see much more than he could in the SUV, he could smell much more too. All sorts of interesting smells. If they were driving by a bakery, he could smell the fresh bread, or they drove by a restaurant, Solo could smell the fresh hamburgers. Solo really liked that one. When they drove down country lanes, Solo could smell the fresh fields or the cows. Solo wasn't as keen on that last one. Solo would sit in the passenger seat of the two-seat car directly next to Dad. Solo would watch as Dad changed gear and turned the wheel, and wondered when he would be able to have a turn. But then memories of him driving the family's SUV, with the vicar hanging onto the front of the car for dear life, would come to his mind. Solo decided best to let Dad do the driving. Besides, as he wasn't driving, Solo could play. One of Solo's favorite sports was to open his mouth as they drove along and see how many flies he could catch. Another was a combination of people watching and smell checking. He could play this game when they were stuck in traffic. Solo would look at the car next to him to see what the driver of that car was up to. Sometimes they had the car window open, which meant he could smell what was going on in that car. And sometimes the driver of the other car was eating something. Solo would look longingly at the food, as usually the food that was being eaten in the other car was food he was not allowed to have at home. Usually it was a hamburger or a sandwich. Sometimes, though, the driver would be eating a slice of pizza, or even drinking a milkshake. Solo had never once been allowed a milkshake. But the idea of drinkable ice cream seemed irresistible. But no matter how much he had hinted in the past to his family that he would like to try one, they had steadfastly refused to give him one. So Solo was reduced to looking longingly at what the people in the other cars were eating or drinking, and if their windows were down, smelling their food too. It was the smell that would make Solo lick his lips in appreciation. Once in a while, when they were stuck in traffic and there was a car stuck right beside them, Solo could almost reach out and grab the food from the other driver. That's how close he was to trying something new. One day, Dad and Solo had gone for a drive with the roof of the sports car down. The roof was down for two reasons. Firstly, Dad liked to drive with the roof down, regardless of the weather. And secondly, because the roof was once again stuck. And no matter how much Dad pulled, he couldn't get it to come back up. Dad decided not to tell his wife about this little problem. "This'll be our secret, right, Solo?" he said to Solo as they pulled out of the drive. Solo grinned. He had no idea why Dad would want to put the roof up in the first place. Surely it made perfect sense for every car to have the roof down. In fact, why have a roof in the first place? It was so much better to drive along with the wind in your face, your ears being blown back and mouth wide open to catch as many flies as possible. Dad steered the car down the country lanes. He needed to buy some parts for his lawnmower, and the best place to buy these was at some shops in the nearby town. Traffic was light as they sped down the narrow lanes, but became heavier as they got closer to town. In fact, it slowed to a crawl. The smells of the town hit Solo's nose. The traffic, some restaurants, and even some of the people walking nearby. As they continued to go along at a slow pace, the traffic coming in the other direction slowed too. It was a hot day, and many drivers had their windows open. Soon the traffic came to a complete stop in both directions, and Dad started to worry that his old car might overheat. Solo wasn't worried about the condition of Dad's old car. His nose had picked up the smell of something very interesting indeed. Hamburger. This was another food Solo had never been allowed to have at home. Why was it his family insisted on always giving him dog food? They got to try all sorts of food. Why couldn't Solo? Wasn't he an equal member of the family? Solo sniffed the air, attempting to locate the source of the smell of hamburger. He looked around. Nothing. But the smell was getting stronger and stronger. He looked over to Dad's side of the car. He could see a small car stuck in traffic in the other direction, with the window down, and the driver, seemingly, eating a piece of hamburger. Solo licked his lips. Not only did the hamburger smell amazing, it looked amazing too. Even from this distance, Solo could see the crispy exterior of the hamburger. Not only that, the driver of the car seemed to be enjoying every single bite. Suddenly, Dad's car moved forward, closer now to the other car and the hamburger-eating driver. Solo could now see that this was no ordinary hamburger. It had cheese on it. It was a cheeseburger. Solo's favorite foods, ice cream and cheese, were among those he wasn't allowed to have. The idea of a cheeseburger, meat and cheese, inside a delicious bread bun, was more than he could fathom, especially as he was so close. He decided to give the driver of the other car one of his famous stares. Most humans found Solo's unblinking stares unnerving and would find a way to avoid Solo's gaze. Solo was hoping that the man driving the car would see his stare and take the hint, perhaps even offer Solo a piece of the cheeseburger as the cars passed each other. Now the cars were virtually side by side. Dad and the other driver could literally reach out and touch each other. But the other driver completely ignored Solo, instead continuing to eat the cheeseburger with enthusiasm. In fact, Solo noticed that almost half the cheeseburger had been eaten. Soon the entire thing would be gone, and Solo would have not had even a slight taste. Solo found this whole situation unacceptable. The cars still weren't moving, giving Solo a clear view of the man eating the cheeseburger. Now there were only a few bites left, and it seemed that the man had absolutely no intention of sharing any of it with Solo. Solo looked at the rapidly disappearing cheeseburger. He thought through how he could grab a bite. In order to get to it, he would need to jump across Dad, leap the small gap between the two cars, and grab the cheeseburger from the driver's hand. Solo had no doubt he could do it. Once at Wimbledon, he had grabbed a tennis ball as it was about to be hit by a tennis player right out of her hand. Solo knew he needed to act fast. The cars could move further apart at any moment. Worse, the entire hamburger could be eaten. The consequences of jumping across from one car to another to grab someone else's food didn't cross his mind. Solo decided, as usual, that it was best to focus on the objective and worry about getting in trouble after he had the cheeseburger. Act now, worry later, should be Solo's motto. Solo decided to make his move. Dad, who was minding his own business, softly humming a tune to himself, suddenly found his vision blocked by a giant blob of white as Solo leapt in front of him. The white blob was gone in an instant as Solo made a skillful leap from Dad's car to the other car. But Solo misjudged the leap. His plan had been to grab the burger from the man's hand and, before he could do anything, leap back into Dad's car. Instead, he ended up sitting on the driver's lap, facing directly into the very surprised driver's face. They stared at each other for a few seconds. Neither knew quite what to do. Meanwhile, Dad was trying to understand what had just happened and where on earth Solo had gone. It never occurred to him to look in the car next to him, as he first thought Solo had, for some unknown reason, jumped out of the car and onto the road. Just then, the traffic eased up in both directions, and the drivers behind both Dad and the cheeseburger driver started to grow impatient that they weren't moving. Some began to press their car horns. In the other car, the man had begun to understand that a large and quite heavy white dog had suddenly appeared on his lap, seemingly from out of nowhere. Gaining his composure, the man placed the remains of his cheeseburger on the car's dash and started to push Solo off his lap and towards the window where Solo had come from. Solo, seeing his prize now on the dash, quickly turned his head, grabbed the remains of the cheeseburger in his large mouth, and before the man could do anything, jumped back out of the window, this time landing on Dad before clambering over to the passenger seat from where he had come from in the first place. Dad grunted as the face full of white fur moved away from him. He still had no idea where Solo had gone or why. All he did know was that his passenger was back and that a line of cars behind him were now sounding their horns loudly as they waited for Dad to move. Dad felt he had no choice but to put the car in gear and drive off. The mystery of where Solo had gone for those few seconds would have to wait. Meanwhile, Solo settled down in the passenger seat to eat the last few bites of the cheeseburger. And boy, was it good. Better than he'd expected. His only regret was he should have acted sooner and therefore grabbed more burger. Dad drove for a few minutes, then pulled over to look at Solo and see if he could understand what had happened. "Solo, what did you do?" he said. Solo, now sitting back up on his haunches, gave Dad his, "Oh, me? Me? What do you mean?" look. Dad gave Solo a hard stare. Solo focused on his look of innocence. Then Dad looked closer. Hanging out of the side of Solo's mouth was a small piece of the cheeseburger. "What the—" he muttered. He leaned over. Solo quickly stuck out his tongue and sucked the remaining food into his mouth. "Nothing to see here," he seemed to be saying. Dad sighed. Whatever it was that Solo did in those few seconds would have to wait. It was just another of Solo's little mysteries. Meanwhile, not too far away, the driver of the other car had also pulled over. He tried to piece together what had happened. Had a large white dog really landed in his lap, then stared him directly in the face? Or was it simply a weird daydream brought on by stress? He decided, like Dad, not to focus on what may or may not have happened. Best to pretend the whole thing never happened. The next day, after a good night's rest, he decided the whole big white dog situation had in fact been a weird daydream. Feeling better, he decided that in the future he would get more sleep, exercise more, and eat better food. All this would help prevent him from seeing things. Whistling, he got back in his car and was about to start it up when he looked down. His eyes got bigger and bigger as he understood. There on the floor, right by his feet, was a large amount of very white, very fluffy fur.